survey data show that the public's very positive about vaccination. I mean, of course, we've got the small, very vocal anti-vax group like everywhere. I mean, we have some people who are vaccine hesitant. And so the challenge then, of course, is to make vaccination very accessible. And one of the changes the government announced today is they're going to rapidly expand the eligible age groups to essentially everyone within the next month. And the reason is partly to get whole family groups in at once, which again is one approach to make vaccination more accessible for people.
So what sort of vaccines do you have at your disposal? Of course, with age groups, it's really dependent on the safety behind the various vaccines that are out there.
Well, New Zealand's using Pfizer vaccine exclusively. The country ordered 10 million doses, and they're now being delivered in larger numbers. I mean, our rollout has been actually dependent on getting the vaccine. That's been the limiting factor, not so much the ability to deliver the vaccine. But now the vaccines are arriving in much larger quantities, and there'll be sufficient vaccine to give everyone 2 doses by the end of the year.
Michael, with this new model unveiled today, what is it telling us about how New Zealand is going forward versus how other countries are managing this sort of move to try and live with COVID?
Yes, well, I think New Zealand is taking a very different approach from the roadmap described by Australia and also by Singapore. And they have said quite clearly that the end point is going to be learning to live with the virus. And in New Zealand, we do not accept that at all. And we are going to stick with an elimination approach as long as we can. And we think one of the big benefits is this gives us a choice. And it means that if, for example, in 6 months' time, when we would get to a critical juncture, we find that the virus is getting more infectious and more dangerous globally, we may really stick with that elimination approach, which is tougher in some ways. But if we look at all the key indicators in New Zealand, we've had the lowest mortality in the OECD from COVID-19. The economy is surging ahead. We've got extremely low unemployment, and the level of freedoms in New Zealand are extremely high. So most New Zealanders really back the direction we're taking, and I think would want to retain those benefits and the certainty that comes with them. And in a sense, we want to be masters of our own destiny. We don't want to be driven by what the pandemic's doing. And I think there's quite a bit of logic around that approach and a lot more certainty, as long as we can sustain it, of course.
How then, though, do you balance this notion of trying to open up the borders a little, get tourism back, people being able to come back to New Zealand, as well as very carefully monitoring the flow of the infection through the community?
Look, I think there is conflict there, and the volume of travellers that will probably be able to come back into New Zealand will be much smaller. I think it will be essential workers, it'll be New Zealand citizens, so for family reasons, and partly for education reasons as well. But I think the idea of mass tourism is a very long way in the future. And I think a lot of things would have to happen before we would return to that state. And I think maybe that's going to be an issue for, around the globe for many years to come.
So who will be allowed, do you think, into New Zealand under this new model? You're looking at an individual risk-based model. You're looking at home isolation, self-managed isolation. Well,
there's 3 tiers, and people would be assigned to those pathways depending on vaccination status, the state of the outbreak in the country where they're coming from, and also there'd be, regardless, there'll be pre- and post-travel testing. But the big unknown is really what is the state of the pandemic in those source countries. And if it's raging on across the globe or even intensifying, and if there's problems with the ability of vaccines to suppress transmission, then it may be that the volume of people coming through the quarantine-free pathway might be very small. I'm really hoping it isn't. I'm hoping that the vaccination strategies will really dampen down transmission. But there are some quite disturbing data coming out at the moment about the ability of vaccines to actually suppress transmission. They're very good at protecting people from death and serious illness, at least at the moment. And obviously vaccination is absolutely vital. But we can't really guarantee what the pandemic will look like, I think, several months ahead and maybe early next year. And that's going to be the critical time when New Zealand's going to have to make these really hard choices about what volumes of travellers we can admit, where they're going to come from, and so on.
Yeah, but when you're looking at what's happening now, of course, and that's in, you know, you have to bear that in mind in terms of how flexible New Zealand can be, is suddenly I imagine the travel bubble is all but closed to most Australians at the moment.
Yeah, it is, unfortunately. It's been suspended for at least another 6 weeks or so. And it's really not looking very promising for opening that up. And this will be a big decision for the government. This is irrespective of our the strategy announced today. This is obviously the green zone with Australia. Whether the government will consider a more selective approach. For example, parts of Australia that are succeeding just as well as New Zealand with elimination, obviously Western Australia and Tasmania, for example, whether we might have or we might resume quarantine-free travel with those parts of Australia. I mean, that's a decision for the future.
Although your top medical advisor that's been sort of behind New Zealand's COVID response has been very critical of the New South Wales strategy at the moment, where we're seeing numbers going up. There was no firm, quick lockdown. Does that pose a threat to the rest of Australia being open to New Zealand?
Yeah, unfortunately it does. And we know that, of course, borders are relatively porous between some states in Australia, which is understandable. So, yeah, I think that is going to be a real challenge for opening up to quarantine-free travel with Australia as a whole.
Good to talk, Michael. Thanks so much.
Thank you.